I'm Jessica Morgan, and I'm the curator of the Urs Fischer exhibition here at MOCA in LA. One of the biggest exhibitions that Urs has taken on, in fact involving the two sites of MOCA. MOCA's unusual in having these two quite different positions in terms of museum buildings, and Urs has really tried to emphasize this, let's say. One space is this massive Geffen, the sort of open warehouse space of Geffen, which is characterized by an incredible project realized not only by Urs, but 1,500 people from LA who collaborated with him. And here at MOCA in Grand Avenue, you have a very different type of exhibition. We might call it a more classic exhibition by Urs Fischer, but I think, as you'll see, the exhibition is by no means what we might typically expect from a museum show. Every exhibition is a jigsaw of sorts, but perhaps this is quite exceptionally so in that Urs has treated almost the entire space like one work. So you have the impression that everything is overlapping. In fact, even the space itself has been changed by him by two works that are quite physical interruptions into the space. One, a work that actually belongs to MOCA, is a piece where Urs cuts through the temporary walls of the space. So massive holes, as if a giant had entered the space of MOCA in Grand Avenue and cut through, sliced through the walls, placing the elements that have been extracted, these big circular, oval-shaped wall constructions against the wall, sort of punching through the different spaces. The other piece that really changes the atmosphere at MOCA quite dramatically, for those who are familiar with the space, I think you'll sense it as soon as you come in. He's painted the floor, or in fact, created the effect of the floor being painted, and an unfinished kind of splashed edge, as if someone had perhaps hastily finished the exhibition installation and not bothered to clean up the edges of the room. Urs has brought the atmosphere of the museum back into the atmosphere of the studio, I'd say, like a space of experimentation, something that's in between an artwork, an art space, and the space of the museum. Urs interrupts this notion of the sort of representational figure, and instead we have skeletons, we have ruined bodies, we have partially destroyed bodies. No body is allowed to appear simply as a whole entity. It's not necessarily a macabre impression though, despite the association of skeletons perhaps with something more dark. In Urs's work he uses the skeletons as stand-ins, often for quite humorous characters. They're lying back on a bench, they're leaning on the back of a washing machine. They're very louche, everyday figures. They're not the type of characters that we associate perhaps with the danse macabre or any type of association with skeletons and other artworks. The figure is something that appears over and over again in Urs's work, and in fact often when it's not the skeleton or the female figure in this sort of classic position of the nude figure, for instance, that we associate with artists working on the nude figure in the studio, here Urs presents it in a very different form, sitting atop of a table, often only partially formed. In other cases, the figure is in fact himself. It's his own body. There's a cast of part of Urs's body. In fact, what he was doing was holding a violin. The violin has disappeared, and other hands are appearing to support his own cast of his upper part of the body. But in contrast to this tactility, let's say, or the familiarity of the human scale, we have works that are entirely, let's say, almost digital in their impression. Works using found images, highly produced, a very sort of high resolution of image, whether they're images of movie stars or images of everyday objects, that are then brought into the exhibition as a contrast, let's say, to this more handmade approach to many of his earlier works. Many of Urs's work have a very fantastical character to them. They appear almost as if they're props from a film illustrating a fairy tale. The Bread House, for instance, which is a very classic work by the artist. It's a house literally constructed from bread loaves. They appear to be sort of crumbling and falling apart and situated on top of a group of carpets, of Persian carpets. So, I mean, a very peculiar image, and one that you feel probably came from a childhood story, perhaps. Hansel and Gretel, of course, come to mind, or one of the other Grimm's fairy tales. But here it is, in reality, in the exhibition space, still with a sort of very strange aura around it due to this the oddity of the impression. And next to it in the MOCA exhibition are giant raindrops blown up in the style of someone like Klaus Oldenburg, to a massive scale, and suspended in the space as if a rain cloud were literally passing through the exhibition space. The objects themselves are very, very much handmade objects. Each raindrop has been made by hand and is individual. But the impression overall, particularly with the rain, is a sculptural effect that breaks up the room. So you see through the rain, you see the other works of Fischer in the space. It works not only as a sculptural work, but as a visual device almost to make you try and gather exactly what's happening in the space around it. More recent works of Urs have involved quite a complicated process of casting. We see, again, imagery that we could imagine perhaps being invented in literature, but we don't expect to see in reality. So we have a bed, a four-poster bed, rather Victorian-looking brass bed, perhaps, that has collapsed in on itself, almost as if it's become a fluid rubber quality rather than the stiffness of metal. The sheets and cushions perfectly cast as well, with a finish that feels almost like the crisp white sheet that we expect to see on a bed. But the entire piece has been painted with a sunset-like aura, sort of beautiful blues, reds, pinks, as if the sunset were sort of happening across the work itself. Again, a very unusual image, a very odd image, something that Fischer's perhaps renowned for inventing this sort of type of imagery that we don't expect to see in reality in front of us. Similar to this piece, and from around the same time, is the lamp, Frozen, the pink lamp. Again, the artist has chosen to cast not the type of lamppost that we're used to seeing in the 21st century urban city, not a slim, very sort of limited in terms of its definition lamppost that we see lining the streets of any urban environment now, but instead a very Victorian, ornate lamppost where every detail, again, as the piece becomes collapsed and sort of has this rubber-like impression as if the piece is literally about to melt onto the floor, every detail can then be exaggerated in terms of the process of this, almost like an implosion within the work itself. The other aspect of the work that is so remarkable is this movement from material to material. We have within the exhibition a construction made from bricks, ordinary clay bricks brought from Switzerland. They have a particular nice reddish tone, but it's a very simple construction of a model building made out of brick and cement. Other works are produced from wood. There's a sculpture that involves a veneer, let's say, of egg white and sugar. So it's an artist who is constantly trying to challenge himself in terms of what materials would be most appropriate, what's easiest, what's best, what gives the right finish, how do we produce a particular type of look in sculpture, or in fact perhaps play against the weight. If we look at something that looks as if it's incredibly light, in fact it's made by something heavy, vice versa. So as you walk through the exhibition, I think you constantly see the way in which he's thought very carefully about how each work should be produced, what material is most appropriate, or which material is most surprising. The Geffen site has a very different atmosphere. Urs had worked over many weeks with people who were invited to come and participate, making this massive sculpture called Yes, let's say, if we call it one sculpture, a massive installation made of many, many different sculptural experiments by all the people who came in. You see recognizable figures, Jabba the Hutt, we see Lego figures, we see human representation, we see monsters. It's really the kind of outpouring of an incredible group imagination. And the piece really encompasses the entire space of the Geffen, so a massive area. Fitted in between the walls of the existing space, so Urs took on the spaces that had been left from the previous exhibition, allowed people to work in all the nooks and the crannies and the different areas of the Geffen to create all-over clay sculpture. Thousands of different types of forms created by the 1,500 people who came in to make them. At the same time in the Geffen, we have a number of other works of Urs's that work either with this atmosphere, on the one hand, his wax sculptures. He's an artist who's worked with wax on a number of occasions, I think drawn to the fact that the sculpture is constantly mutating, changing during the process of its melting. It's very hard to imagine another type of sort of monolithic sculpture of the scale that he produces there at the Geffen that could actually begin to dematerialize during the run of the exhibition. Here he used the sculpture of Gian Bologna. It's the Rape of the Sabine Women, a massive sculpture, a Mannerist masterpiece, and he's cast it in wax and then presented it within the Geffen alongside these clay pieces, which of course will inevitably also decay and disappear at the end of the exhibition as they gradually turn to dust. They're unfired clay, so inevitably won't last beyond the run of the exhibition. So we have this one aspect of the exhibition which is about dematerialization, about a process of sort of creation, let's say, and then the gradual decay. And on the other hand, at Geffen, there is a separate space with an entirely different character, perhaps the sort of yin and the yang of that particular location. Here we enter a very low-ceilinged room where Urs has used a photographic wallpaper technique in order to reproduce the studio of the artist Josh Smith in these spaces, doubled up, in fact. It's a typical New York loft artist space, something that we might imagine represented in films and our imagination of what it is to live in this type of New York long loft space in the city. And in the second space of the Josh Smith wallpaper is a new work by Urs that is an extraordinary cast of a horse whose body is colliding with a medical bed, a hospital bed. It's an image, again, that I think probably only Urs Fischer could dream up, of a sort of strange collision, clearly, obviously not a morbid image, but one of two very different forces colliding. So we have the animal of the horse with the sort of instrument of the hospital bed. So outside of the space of the Geffen, with the massive project by the 1,500 people, is a work of Urs's, which is one of a series of magnifications, blow-ups of very small clay sculptures. In fact, if you look at it, you can see the thumbprint of the artist, only here writ 40 feet high. It's a piece that, of course, is perfect in dialogue with what's happened within the Geffen, Urs's own experiments with clay. He makes many, many different sort of playful experiments with small pieces of clay so big. And then selecting the one that he wants to work with, magnifies it, casts it, and produces it in this massive scale, sort of many stories high. So this work is outside of the Geffen, a kind of monument, in a sense, to the potential of clay, we could say, or the potential of the experiment with this type of material. Connecting, of course, the ephemeral clay that's inside of the Geffen, all of the extraordinary experiments of the many people who are there, but bringing it outdoors and producing something that will inevitably last far longer.